addressing how the Postal Service and the mailing industry is responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we begin, I want to make sure that I thank Escher, a PostCom member who has graciously agreed to sponsor today's webinar. Their logo and their web address are up on the home screen here. Very kind and generous of them to agree to sponsor this activity on such short notice, and I want to make sure that I call them out before we begin. A couple of quick comments before we get into the content. The main priority today is to allow a forum for people to get any questions they have about what's going on in the industry answered. So we're leaving the sound open for all participants, and we'll only mute if we have to, and want to encourage active participation. I don't want anyone to feel like they necessarily have to wait until the end. I do have some prepared content, but this is intended to be interactive. Feel free to raise your hand, use the chat box if you want to ask a question, or if you find an opportunity and want to vocally express your question or comment, please feel free to do so, and we'll try to keep this going in as open and participatory a way as we possibly can. So without further ado, I want to start off with just an agenda for today's call. The Postal Service held a call with industry associations just a couple of hours ago. I'll just start off with that before getting into their response in general over the last week and a half. And then I know people are watching what's happening on the Hill. That's a fluid and developing situation. In fact, there's very recent news on that, so we'll get into that a little bit. I do want to talk about what PostCom is doing and some of the changes we are making as this situation, which in my lifetime is unprecedented, unfolds. And then a quick, for purposes of reference, we have some links to resources that are available to the public to get additional information, because I think, as many people know, information on this subject seems to change constantly. And so anything I say here might easily be out of date before this call ends. And so we want to provide some links so people can do some follow-up research if they choose to. And then we'll just open it up for Q&A for anyone that has any, because I know some people are extremely busy dealing with crisis situations in their own companies and may not have had as much time to delve into some of this topic area as we have. So I want to start off with the structural steps the Postal Service has taken to try to address the ongoing coronavirus situation. Not surprisingly, because the Postal Service is in every community around the U.S., they have taken aggressive steps to stand up a dedicated pool of resources to act on behalf of the Postal Service in addressing all corona-related situations in their network. And they're calling it the COVID-19 Command Team. It reports through Pat Donka directly into the Postmaster General. The command team itself is led by Kristen Seaver, who of course is the Chief Information Officer and Executive Vice President. But for the time being, she is stepping aside from that duty and is working full-time as head of the Postal Service's COVID-19 Command Team. And here we see the structure that is put in place under Kristen Seaver. Most of these individuals are probably pretty well known to people in the industry. They're generally Postal Service vice presidents and are, again, pretty familiar names. The one who's probably the most customer-facing is Steve Monteith, and he is identified here as being in charge of customer continuity. He has been the designated representative for the Postal Service in dealing with the industry, and he is the one hosting a series of regular calls, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We've got somebody, I think it's Frank Lynn, generating a fair amount of background noise. I'd ask Frank to silence his phone so that we can continue. As this sort of structural slide indicates, the Postal Service is, I would say, sparing no expense in trying to address the challenges that COVID-19 is creating for its organization. And here sort of gives you an idea of how the four main focus areas on the command team are set up and their individual areas of responsibility. We, as I mentioned, have been dealing primarily with Steve Monteith and his group, but not surprisingly, this situation is creating significant challenges for the Postal Service as they try to keep their employees safe, as they try to maintain continuity of operations across their far-flung network, and as they try to make sure that they can adequately supply their employees and their facilities with the materials and products necessary to meet this unprecedented challenge. So there have been operational impacts on the Postal Service, and there's new information about those impacts on an ongoing basis. So I will not be talking about specific locations or specific facility impacts, but I will note what the Postal Service has been communicating to us in their regular presentations to industry and in my interactions with individuals at the Postal Service. Thus far, the impact on domestic services has been surprisingly limited. There have been instances where the Postal Service has had to temporarily shut down specific locations and to reroute mail because of employees who test positive for the virus. Sometimes it's not entirely clear that that is what's happened. In fact, just within the last hour, there was an industry alert about a retail unit in Mississippi that is having its mail rerouted, which I suspect is coronavirus related, but the industry alert did not specify. On the other hand, there have been some more generalized impacts on international service, which again, perhaps not surprising. The virus is worldwide, but is affecting different countries in different ways. As I'm sure everyone knows, Italy, for example, has been particularly hard hit, and it is one of many countries that have either inhibited or completely restricted inbound international shipments. Also, in a more general sense, because of curtailment of international flights by various airlines, the Postal Service, which does rely on commercial air for transporting its products, has experienced some reduction in international lift capacity. And because of specific countries not accepting inbound international shipments, the Postal Service has indicated that they are having to make real-time decisions to shift transportation modes. For example, if they can't fly product into a specific country, they are looking for ways to fly into neighboring countries and then use truck or other transportation modes to then get it into the destinating country. The Postal Service's activities here are confounded somewhat by the fact that the exchange of international goods and services, of course, is governed by the Universal Postal Union, and the Postal Service is not the U.S. government's representative to the UPU. That's the State Department. So decisions about shipments going into specific countries from the United States are not under the direct control of the Postal Service. They are working with the Department of State, but the Postal Service has found itself in a position of having to accept mail destined for countries where they know it cannot get to as they await action by the State Department. I have noted that there are frequent updates from the Postal Service on status changes on specific international destinations, and people should be on the lookout for industry alerts coming from Barry Burns on a regular basis because that situation seems to change daily. The Postal Service has indicated they have provided new field instructions for changes in their signature policy. They are still seeking signatures where necessary for either package or accountable mail shipments, but are modifying their procedures to address the fact that employees and customers are going to be wary of interacting too closely with anyone at this time. A couple things came up on this week's MTAC webinars that were also addressed in this morning's call with Steve Monteith and the rest of the command team. The Postal Service is piloting or trying to pilot and test redirection of remittance mail. They are working through necessary internal technical and perhaps regulatory challenges for how this will get done. It is not clear yet how quickly they will be scaling up this activity. I reached out to Gary Reblin yesterday, and he has indicated they do plan to reconvene a teleconference for the Remittance Mail Advisory Committee. Not clear exactly when that will happen. I think it will probably wait until they have worked through some internal issues. Steve Monteith mentioned again today, or actually it was, on the last call, that the Postal Service finds itself having to re-examine and modify its policies for holding and forwarding mail because of the sheer number of businesses that are closing suddenly. And when you are forced by your governor to immediately close your doors, the first thing on your mind is probably not filing a hold notice or a change of address notice with the Postal Service. So they are trying to get a handle on how best to modify those procedures given the rapidly evolving circumstances. Another thing that came up sort of in passing is that the Postal Service has gotten requests from customers on whether or not they can do digital only mailing through the informed delivery platform into specific zip codes where they may not be able to have sufficient density to do physical mail pieces into that zip code. The Postal Service is looking at this. They haven't made a decision to offer it yet, but they are considering it. There are some tricky pricing and technical issues to work through. I talked to Gary just a couple of hours ago. They are thinking through how to do this and what it would look like. This is something that PostCom's executive committee will be discussing on Monday. We have started having weekly calls as we think about how best to respond to changes that are arising in response to the coronavirus pandemic. I'm going to quickly pause there before transitioning into the next subject area in case anyone has any comments or questions. There's nothing in the chat box, but I want to at least pause for a few seconds before I move on. All right, then, hearing none, let's keep going. The Postal Service, I'll be honest, early on during this situation, I thought was a little tardy in getting communications out to customers and their representatives. To their credit, I think they have stepped up and are doing much better in the last week or so, and they appear to be committed to maintaining that to the extent necessary. I have some appreciation for the difficult situation they are in and appreciate the efforts they are making. And I think people have probably seen some of these things. About a week ago, actually it was a week ago on a Sunday night, the Postal Service sent out through ATTAC and various associations a letter indicating that the Postal Service is deemed an essential service, and by extension, private companies who are engaged in the production, distribution, and transportation of mail are deemed essential services. That was intended to clarify for local and state government officials in the event that any employee of any service provider or mailer is questioned about whether they should or should not be working in the event that there is a local or statewide restriction on movement and activity. That letter has been helpful in clarifying the situation. Almost immediately upon issuance, we asked for a letter with a signature on it. The one that was released really didn't have any signature block whatsoever. That was addressed again today by the Postal Service. They are working through the legal impediments to putting somebody's name and title on the signature block and who that ought to be, given the circumstances. It appears they are trying to get that done, but at this point in time, there is not yet a definitive date when that will happen. More recently, the Postmaster General issued a letter expressing or laying out the Postal Service's priorities in addressing the COVID-19 outbreak. We appended a copy of PMG's letter to this week's PostCom bulletin. It's also available on the Postal Service's website. Again, helpful information coming from the Postal Service. Not sure there will be any further update or messaging from the PMG, but that for now at least expresses the official position of the Postal Service on how they are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as I mentioned, there are industry alerts on a daily basis, even more frequent in some circumstances. Again, not surprising given that they operate in every state and every community, and because many of the responses to coronavirus have been local or state-based in nature. So again, because they happen so frequently, in fact, there might have been one in the last 15 minutes, we would advise people to regularly check the Postal Service's website. We've put the link to the specific location on usps.com, where they're providing the most recent official pronouncements on Postal Service response. And as I should have mentioned at the outset, we will have these slides available on the PostCom website immediately after this webinar. Let's talk a little bit about legislation and where we are. We still do not have signed legislation in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Senate has passed legislation just yesterday. That legislation would provide an additional $10 billion in authority for the Postal Service over and above what is already allowed by statute. It's important to note that $10 billion, again, it's just a loan. It would have to be paid back, and unless something else changes, would be paid back by postage revenues. That $10 billion is only for use to defray operating expenses. It is not designed to be used, for example, to purchase new trucks. Now, admittedly, postal funds are somewhat fungible, and the Postal Service does already have a fair amount of cash on hand, so they won't necessarily be prohibited from using some of their available cash to make capital investments. My assumption is that given the specificity of this provision in the Senate bill, they will be reluctant to expend much on capital until this crisis is passed. But the $10 billion will provide the Postal Service a helpful infusion of liquidity at a time when they're expected to lose significant amounts of market-dominant mail volume. That Senate bill also expressly requires the Postal Service to prioritize the delivery of goods and services that are designed to react to the coronavirus outbreak. And it's not clear yet that the Postal Service will be expected to handle a lot of shipments of things like masks or rubber gloves, but that is the express intent of the Senate legislation. There has been a response from members of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee who were not too pleased with the Senate's measures to address postal issues. There was already a House proposal that was much more generous to the Postal Service. It would have allowed $25 billion for revenue forgone. That would not have been a loan. That would have been essentially an appropriation available to the Postal Service in the event that they lose revenue. It also would have required significant expansion of vote by mail, not surprising given the concern that people may be unable to vote in person for some indeterminate period of time. It also had, it would have forgiven all of the Postal Service's outstanding debt, which right now is about $11 billion. Unfortunately, or fortunately, given your perspective, the Senate perceived that those provisions as essentially giveaways and did not include them. There is going to be another House proposal. The House, I should point out, is expected to approve the Senate legislation as passed. It will not go through unanimous consent. It appears that one House member from Kentucky is going to prevent that happening, but there is every expectation that the House, when it comes to a floor vote, will overwhelmingly approve the Senate bill with bipartisan support. So it is still clearly expected to be signed into law, but not as quickly as we would have liked. Then there will be more. The House is working on another proposal that they will then send to the Senate, and there are expected to be further rounds of perhaps not what we would call stimulus packages, but relief packages that will be passed by Congress. Whether additional postal provisions make their way into future legislation is unclear. There appears to be resistance, not just from some senators, but from members of the administration to doing anything more than the $10 billion extension of borrowing authority that has already been approved. I'm going to pause right there and respond. We've got a question into the chat box. And it's a question about the change to the Postal Service's holding and closure policies. At this point, I want to make it clear, the Postal Service is not changing any of its delivery policies. It is still delivering mail everywhere, and they plan to continue to deliver mail unless something changes. What they have had to do, though, is typically when a business closes suddenly without issuing a forwarding order or any kind of hold order, they hold the mail for 10 days and then immediately return it to sender. They are relaxing that provision until they have a better handle on how long this situation is likely to persist. So they will not be imposing that 10-day requirement as they typically do. And I hope that answers the question that came in on the chat box. And now we'll go forward. What is PostCom doing? Well, certainly what we're doing is we have escalated the frequency and amount of direct engagement with Postal Service management and officers, and that's on a very issue-specific basis, depending on what our members are seeking assistance with. I mentioned having had a discussion with Gary earlier today to try to get some clarity on what their thinking is with regards to digital-only informed delivery in specific zip codes and how they're thinking about rolling that out. We've had one-on-one discussions with people in pricing and with payment technologies on how they are trying to perhaps pull together ways to keep people in the mail as some of their customers see their business clients struggling. And so we're going to try to work as closely with them as we can and to be as supportive as we can, and also to sort of advocate for specific efforts that the Postal Service can and should be pursuing right now. To that end, we are working with other associations where we've been working all week on sort of a joint statement outlining specific supportive measures that we think the Postal Service should take and that the Postal Regulatory Commission should facilitate. Those could and should include different types of rate relief, perhaps deferral of postage, perhaps postponement of some scheduled price increases that were designed to take effect later this summer. We've also had some sort of behind the scenes back and forth with the Postal Service on those very same issues. So look for us to be publishing something in a public forum as soon as we can nail that down. Last week, PostCom filed a couple of motions with the Postal Regulatory Commission. As always, the PRC has many different dockets pending at any given time. And in many cases, those are relatively routine and don't require much in the way of resource expenditure. So no reason to shut that down. But we did file motions asking that the Postal Regulatory Commission put a temporary hold on the 10-year review of market dominant regulations, and also on an open docket that addresses the scope of the Postal Service's monopoly. It's not that we don't think those are important, but we think that in both cases, for slightly different reasons, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for the Postal Regulatory Commission to reach definitive conclusions about the future direction of the industry until we have a better idea of how long this ongoing situation is going to persist, and until we get some insight into the impact that this crisis is going to have on mail volumes and on the finances of the Postal Service. So we thought it better if the Commission just hit the pause button and can resume those activities once there's a little more clarity. We are trying to sort of fill in the messaging gaps to members without overwhelming them. This webinar is an example of that, and we will do these on an as-needed basis until things return to normal. I mentioned in passing that we are now having weekly meetings with our, via teleconference of course, with our executive committee to sort of check in and to level set as things develop from week to week. This webinar is the byproduct of the most recent of those conference calls. The next one is scheduled for Monday, and we will continue those on an as-needed basis, and that's where we will sort of make decisions about other specific actions that PostCom can take to support the mailing industry. An open question for us as an association is our next in-person board meeting, currently scheduled for the first week in June. At this point, it's too early for us to cancel that, even though everything else on our individual calendars seems to have been postponed. That's far enough out into the future. We've not yet taken that step, but early April, we have a decision to make about either canceling or not, because then our financial commitment to our host location increases substantially. So between now and then, depending on how this situation either resolves itself or continues to unfold, we'll make a decision about the June board meeting, and we'll communicate that as soon as that decision has been reached. I mentioned some resources. So these links, I'm not going to go through them one by one, other than to note that this is where I go on a regular basis to check on any information that the Postal Service is providing, on any recent developments on the Hill, given that legislation is pending. And of course, the primary sources of data on the virus itself are the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control. The one I want to focus most, though, is this last one on the bottom. The Postal Service has asked that anybody communicating directly with them on the COVID-19 outbreak or the Postal Service's response to it, use this designated email address, industryfeedback@usps.com. That address is new, but to make sure that they prioritize incoming questions, they ask that people put COVID-19 in the subject line so that that can be prioritized for response. While I regularly reach out directly to various VPs and managers in the Postal Service, I have also started using this for more routine inquiries, and it does appear that the Postal Service is checking this on a regular basis and responding in a pretty timely fashion. That was our prepared remarks. I tried to get through those as quickly as possible to leave as much time as we could for open Q&A. And so if anyone on the call has any questions or has any insights into something that I didn't cover that they think would be of value to the people we have assembled today, now's the time for us to open things up. And I guess I should remind, since I so strongly asked people to mute at the beginning, if you've accidentally muted yourself or forgot to unmute yourself and are struggling to be heard, I'll ask one more time. This is our opportunity to have open Q&A if anyone needs additional information or we did not address anything that they are curious about. All right, no backlog in the chat box. Going once. Going twice. All right, then. I'll start to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for participating today. We've recorded the webinar and we'll make a recording available upon request. The slides we used today will be on the PostCom website. We do plan to schedule a follow-up and we'll send out a notice when that has been scheduled. The exact time and location will really depend on how events change in the next couple of days. I have a feeling we'll do this probably in a couple of weeks, but it will really depend on what our members want and on how rapidly things change, or if there are significant developments. You know, as in a situation like this, there's always and almost certainly the possibility that we will be surprised or overtaken by external events. And if that happens and we recognize the need to open up another opportunity to share information, we will do so and we will communicate that. In the meantime, I want to thank everyone one more time for participating today. I want to thank Escher again for sponsoring this, and I want to invite anyone who is on the call today that in the event we didn't address something you think is important, or if you have recommendations or suggestions on how we can improve these going forward, please reach out to me directly. We welcome that kind of feedback and we'll take it into account. And until the next time I have an opportunity to speak with any of you, and let's all hope that before too long we will not be solely dependent on telephonic communication. Thanks again for participating today, and we'll be reaching out as soon as we need to. Thank you very much.